All right, my questions and answers today. We're going to do some Q&A. It's a little bit of a pessimistic view of humanity and how we're ever going to deal with addiction and mental health issues. It began with, I saw a video that Sarah Silverman did. So do you know her?
Yeah.
She's a brilliant Jewish comedian. And she began by saying, she's been thinking a lot about the conservation of energy, which is the physics principle that all mass and energy convert to one another. There's a constant state in the universe. E equals mc squared is one version of that. And she did an experiment on it. I don't think she was joking. And her experiment was she pulled up to some guy's car in her local marijuana dispensary in LA. And she got really close to the guy, and the guy became really upset with her. And he's some over muscled tattoo guy, and he came out screaming at her. And she talked him down and converted his energy into a positive feeling. Now, Sarah Silverman's a brilliant woman. She's as primitive as a native in South America, you know, where they walk around without loincloths. And they believe the sun and planes are on tracks in the sky. Or if you go back to the Middle Ages, where if there's an eclipse, people were convinced that the earth was going to end in the next day or two. Sarah Silverman's level of thinking is the same as that. She thinks that ultimate physics principles explain why in LA, if a guy's really pissed off at her, it's a good idea to talk him into a positive mood. She thinks those occur on the same plane of existence. Now, what can I say? I mean, she went to college. She's a sophisticated modern thinker. And as I said, she's a brilliant woman, but she is a comedian, and she did make a good routine out of it. So you might say, well, her misunderstanding, but good fodder for TV and for our podcast. But that fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the universe, of the level of analysis, that because something happens in the sky or in the universe, that implies something's going to happen to you personally. That persists in even the most sophisticated quotes around that. Aspects of American thinking around mental health and addiction. So I'm going to refer to somebody. I think you interviewed Robert Whitaker, and he wrote, of course, The Epidemic of Mental Illness. And Marcia Angel, who's the first woman co-editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, she did a very extensive review of his work in the New York Review of Books.
Just real quick, Whitaker's book is Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Anatomy of an Epidemic. And it's something about mental illness and drugs in the subtitle. Thank you. Robert Whitaker and Marcia Angel think that the only way you get mental illness is by having a lesion in the brain. Their explanation for why there's an epidemic of mental illness is we're giving out drugs which either cause the brain to atrophy or which cause injury to the brain. That's how they thought in the Middle Ages. They thought if you could expose a person's cranium, you would see why, if they were as a mental ill person or a deluded person or a schizophrenic, you would be able to see in their brain the thing that made them mentally ill. Marcia Angel and Robert Whitaker think the same thing.
Do you think they're so absolute about it? For instance, when I interviewed him, he said something about Robert Whitaker. He said something about he's concerned marijuana is causing psychosis. And I thought, oh boy. So I kind of sidestepped into it, and I said, I think that given what the show's about, listeners wouldn't forgive me if I didn't push back on that a little bit. And so I said, what is it that you mean marijuana causes psychosis? Do you mean that marijuana does something to the brain, or, you know, that you smoke marijuana, then you are in psychosis? Or are you saying that if you smoke marijuana and have some sort of an episode because you've just ingested too much, that you're going to be labeled as having psychosis and then you're going to enter into the system? He said, yeah.
He didn't mean the second.
But he said he did. And so I always wonder how much he believes the absolute claim that you would get by reading those books. I always wonder what it would take to sway an opinion by those two, but we can get to that.
It's obviously psychotic to believe that all mental illness is represented by some physical manifestation in the brain that we can identify.
Right.
But his book is about, well, antipsychotic medications do this to your brain. And Marcia Engel jumps in, but now he's a journalist, Robert Whitaker. Marcia Engel's a psychiatrist and a physician, and she teaches at Harvard on global health. And there's an update to the Middle Ages version of a lesion in the brain. In the 1970s, we came up with the idea that neurochemical lapses, failures in synapses cause mental illness. That became a new brain model.
Mm-hmm.
And one man is responsible for that, a man named Richard Restak, who did best-selling books, The Mind and the Body,
Mm-hmm.
The Mind and the Brain, and both were made into public broadcasting programs. So the average educated New Yorker, I guess those books are a little before I think Sarah Silverman might possibly be in her 50s. Is that possible?
Is she really? I always thought she was like my age, but I guess that makes sense. She's in her 50s.
She's older than you, and possibly she's only in her 40s. I don't know if she watched those shows. They claim that everything that we think of as mental illness is somehow to be identified within the brain.
I do have a point here, and I feel I'm worried it's going to derail you because you're
Go ahead.
also making a point.
We like that.
But the thing is, so the Robert Whitakers and Marcia Angels of the world, who are deep thinkers but can't seem to get past this block. I mean, on one hand, they're already saying psychiatrists and their guild think that there's something inherently wrong with people, and if they only just did more dialogic work with them, they could probably realize that there's nothing wrong with them, and certainly they don't need to prescribe medicines to them. The medicines are what's getting them. Then they transfer the misunderstanding to the medicines hurt people. So what I've read from the book and what I've talked to about them is that they have the common sense. They front load the common sense to people aren't broken, but then they transfer to people get broken. And I always wonder what it would take to get rid of that misunderstanding for them. I wonder if they are any further along in being able to be convinced of that misunderstanding, or if they're too far gone because they've devoted their lives to that theory that they wouldn't be able to be convinced.
I like the way you give them credit and give them a nod. You do the same with Carl Hart when you say, well, Carl doesn't believe in this brain disease model of addiction.
It's not necessarily credit, though. I mean, I'm just saying this is my analysis of what
hopeful.
They believe, and I wonder.
You wish that they thought that way. They don't. They have none of them are psychologists. Carl Hart's a neuroscientist. Maya Solovitz is a journalist. Robert Whitaker's a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Marcia Angel, I believe, is a psychiatrist. She might be a physician, though, not with psychiatric training. Psychology is the hardest science of all. People can't believe that something can take place in a person's experience,
right,
and that'll change who they are as a human being. We're going to, by the end of this session, we're going to discuss how Gabor Mate deals with that. He deals with that by deciding that individual experience translates directly into measurable changes in the brain. And there's a man named Albert Bandura, who's among the most famous, he might be the most well-regarded psychologist of the 20th century. And I thought that he explained to people that that's not the way that life works. So people do social learning and they get conceptions in their minds that determine their outlooks and their behavior. I thought everybody knew that. And there is cognitive behavior therapy, which is predicated on that. But I actually don't run into anybody that actually understands that, although there are psychologists.
That's okay. What you just said is exactly what I'm getting at. I'm not trying to give undue credit and I'm not trying to give undue blame. I'm saying are there people who understand enough of what Bandura is saying that if someone right-minded could give them a push in the right direction, they could go the distance with it? I mean, because I think that some people will take what's convenient of what Bandura said about social learning theory. But
Well, here's what I'll quote. I'm completing my memoir, and Archie just corrected me. I translate Ethan addressing me as Stannon, and my cousin Rich Fromberg said they're going to think you were spelling Stanton, and Archie agreed, and we are now representing it as Stannin. So Ethan would say, Stannon. When somebody agrees with you 90% of the time, if they're against drugs as a solution for mental illness, they're on your team.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying.
That's what he would say. I believe that they all have a fundamental incomprehension, and it's not as benign as what you might imagine, because we're having a crisis of an epidemic of mental illness. We are, and the global burden of disease showed that. The United States leads the world.
Yeah,
primitive nations, so-called advanced nations, we have the most mental illness and addiction and life loss due to drugs and mental health of any country. So if the argument is, well, as soon as they saw the bad outcomes due to these things, they would change their minds. That's never going to happen. Maya Zalovitz will come on and you will interview her and says, it's just, she doesn't call it medication assisted treatment. She just calls it medication. Oh, more people are dying constantly, and the states with the most MAT, like Washington State, have the highest increases in the last year in deaths due to drugs. Nothing will dissuade them.
So you can't just say, well, we believe 100 things and we believe 99 in the same of them, so let's just shake hands and call the last one a gentleman's disagreement. You're saying those disagreements are always chalk up to something very fundamental about the way that we perceive things. And
very good. That was pretty well put. We could broadcast that. Okay, and ironically, a person who I don't think of as in the same place as Ethan is the same another person who quotes Ronald Reagan all the time, if you're 90% in agreement, is Johann Hari. And Johann Hari wrote a whole book about the disease theory being bullshit. And then he decided he wanted me to join him in backing a court case in the Massachusetts Supreme Court, claiming that a woman shouldn't go to prison because her addiction was a brain disease. And it takes a certain amount of intellectual integrity, which I would, Ethan's father was a rabbi. I guess I don't know a lot about the rabbi business. I don't know if the job is to make it be popular among the congregation. I don't even know if they call a Jewish gathering a congregation, and I'm Jewish, but, or whether you're supposed to be intellectually sophisticated. Right. I mean, I know Johann Hari, he performs for audiences. And so at some level, for Johann, well, disease, not disease. I believe it's not a disease, but you just go out and tell people that because, sometimes they need to hear it and it's important, maybe for getting a woman out of prison, even if it pollutes the entire intellectual atmosphere. So, I've gone from Sarah Silverman to Marsha Angle and Robert Whitaker to incorporating Maya, Carl, people I admire, Ethan, a friend of mine, a longtime associate, Johann, and the idea that how we think about something actually impacts what the actual manifestation of that thing, it's beyond human ken. To hell with, Albert Bandura being, I think, the most famous psychologist of the 20th century. And there are psychologists who practice and demonstrate that effectively changing and working with people's thinking and environments improves their mental health, even including among the severely mentally ill. That's a whole body of work that shows that. And yet the demonstrated failure of the medical approach to deal successfully, and their psychologists are a lobby, they are a union, they are a group. However, when they had the psychology of alcohol abuse and alcoholism, they had 2 volumes, every single theorist there felt obligated, none of them was a neuroscientific researcher, none of them, all of them felt obligated to describe their actual research results in terms of their fantasies about brain chemistry. Everybody does that. That's just the way it's done nowadays. So I talked a little bit about my memoir, and I talked about how pessimistic I've become because I just don't think human beings can comprehend social learning, which is a major concept in psychology for the last, it's going on 100 years, but it's certainly 50 years. And I wanted to talk about 3 articles in Atlantic magazine. In 1990, I wrote an article called Second Thoughts About a Gene for Alcoholism for Atlantic. And a man named Ken Blum had claimed that he had found the A1 allele of the dopamine gene that caused alcoholism and addiction. And it was such preposterous bullshit. I mean, the mistake that he made was he got a body of unidentified cadavers. They were largely African-American, and this was a trait of that ethnic group that didn't appear in any other population. So I wrote an article for Atlantic about why that finding was wrong. I might take a slight slide shift since I'm talking about my memoir. How did I get to write an article for Atlantic magazine about the genetics of alcoholism? And one of the dichotomies of my life is I knew the fiction editor of Atlantic magazine because I taught at the Harvard Business School. And on Sundays, we had a pickup basketball game in Newton, Mass, which is some upscale, whatever, outside of Boston. And so I knew a man named Michael Curtis. And when this came up, I contacted him and I solicited to write the article. Even my daughter, Anna, doesn't believe this. She said, Dad, Atlantic doesn't do fiction. I said, honey, back in 1990, Michael Curtis was the fiction editor. So anyhow, I want to move on. So you might say, well, Atlantic, that's a humanistic magazine. They had the good sense to appreciate your work. Michael Curtis, I think, is long gone from the magazine. He was older than me, and I'm 75. If Anna's right, they don't do fiction anymore. I have a good friend named Gabrielle Glasser. I love Gabrielle. She's always been extremely generous to me. And in 2015, she wrote an article called The Irrationality of Alcoholics Anonymous. And everybody I knew called my attention to it and said, look, here's somebody in a major publication that's saying how crazy AA is. And then the article turned out to be a pan to naltrexone. Mm-hmm. That naltrexone cures alcoholism and alcohol abuse. And this occurred at a time when Charles O'Brien, the most reductive psychiatric force in addiction, had published an article in JAMA Psychiatry where they compared naltrexone to a placebo on 20 measures. How quickly did people drink again? How much did they drink again? Did they relapse to alcoholism? What was their total amount of drinking? Every possible, and every single, and the findings have always been iffy with naltrexone. This sophisticated group at the University of Pennsylvania decided that it was a specific gene allele that determined who those people who were sensitive to naltrexone and those who were immune to it. And then they published 10 graphics. There was a supplement where you could get all the graphics. Every single curve with both alleles of the gene, with naltrexone and placebo, was shaped identically. All of the severely dependent alcoholics in the study reacted identically, no matter what their genetic makeup, to both placebo and naltrexone. And in all cases, they reduced their drinking. So once again, God bless her, Gabrielle Glasser was thinking, oh, AA's bullshit. It's obviously bullshit. She's Jewish. Jews don't go in and pray to a higher power to cure them. That's not our style. Naltrexone's the answer.
Other fields of journalism, I feel there are going to be journalists who say there seems to be a problem. Here's what the experts say, or here's what experts say is a new trend. That's Gabrielle Glasser. And then there are journalists who are a little more nuanced than that, or a little more experiential, let's say, who say, this is what the experts say, but what's really going on here? I never see that in addiction.
Right. I guess the closest would be Jacob Solom.
Mm.
He's the closest, but he's wary of talking about addiction per se.
Right.
As everybody is. I mean, you know, as Carl Hart doesn't really talk about addiction, as we've discussed. So now I want to go to, and one claim is, Stanton, they agree with you 90%. What's the problem? And I can't imitate Johan Hari's accent. He says the same thing. It's destructive. This misapprehension is destructive. And I'm going to give you an example. In 2021, Hunter Biden, who we've discussed, published his memoir, his addiction memoir and recovery. And it was reviewed by Anna Marie Cox, who I don't know her, I don't know her work. She's apparently a recovering editorial staff member for The Atlantic. In the review, she says, throughout Biden's proximity to depravity and desperation, a sort of class tourism is buffered by whiteness and wealth. What's she saying there?
Any depravity he faces is overcome by his own wealth and privilege.
Right. And that's what the theme of the whole review is. So he can't possibly know anything about addiction. He's always just one phone call away from another rehab or someone coming to rescue him. Indeed, his salvation arrives in the form of his now wife, Melissa, whom he met by the pool at Los Angeles Petit Hermitage, where rates start at $300 a night. On the strength of one date, Melissa took him in and cut off his contact with his party pals. He slept for 3 days and then he proposed. He testifies to sublime contentment to have a son named Bo. So what happened? Hunter Biden got better because he had all kinds of, he doesn't claim the rehab made him better, but it's nice to know that you can call your dad or somebody and say, well, I'd like to go to rehab right now and go to some nice place and cool out. It's nice to know he can spend time in a luxurious hotel and meet a woman, a respectable woman who can be attracted to him because he's a good-looking man, he's a power player, and he's been well-educated. He's a privileged human being. And Anna Marie Cox is saying, well, that's a ruse. That disguises that he's not really doing it the right way. Ironically, she then says this, which is talking about herself. I can't criticize Biden for any of that. I married one of the first people I met in sobriety too. We've discussed how we wonder how that works, but let's put that aside. If Biden is sober and happy today, hey, whatever works, she's writing. But I wonder if he's figured out who he is without the scrutiny of the press or the aid of his family, who he is when he's the only person to get sober for. Well, he's not the only person to get sober for. He has 2 daughters by a previous marriage. He has a son. He has a wife. His father's president of the United States. He has a very caring stepmother. He loved his brother who's died. He has a sister. He's not doing it for himself. But that's and neither is Anna Maria Cox. She says more about herself. If I sound unduly judgy of Biden's story, it's because I don't like how familiar it is. I thought I was hot shit too. I worried about people finding out who I was. I once tried to leave treatment because I didn't want to miss the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and I cried when I canceled the rental of my fancy dress. How do you interpret that sentence? What's that say about Anne Marie Cox?
There are things more important to her than just herself in isolation. I mean, that's like, she's kind of making your point for you, but putting a negative spin on it, right?
She has a job. She's going to the White House Correspondent. You know,
she has
not
a job. She
everybody-
cares what people in the public think of her. Part of her job is to, address the public and important people who make policy decisions.
Look nice when you're doing it. God bless her. She can afford a nice dress. Those are called supports in life. They determine how you see yourself. So she despises too strong a word.
Yeah.
Hunter, because she and he are both privileged people. And the way, in my mind, the way that works, going to all those fancy rehabs is bullshit. However, it's a stand-in. I mean, people who can afford to go to fancy rehabs, Hunter in his memoir describes being in down and out welfare hotels and motels with prostitutes and lifelong drug addicts. Your chances of overcoming addiction are not as good when those are the main people you hang out with.
Right.
So the fact that he met a woman, she seems to be quite a strong person, Melissa Cohen. I hope, I don't want to beat a dead horse. Another Jewish person who said, listen, I believe in you. You're not seeing those people anymore. You've got a different life.
So you said that. Yeah, sorry.
Your father's president at the time. I guess he might not have been president yet.
He at least had been vice president. So,
yeah. I mean, people know who
right.
Joe Biden is.
You sent me this, and when I was reading it, that's how I was thinking about it. It's like she's resentful. She doesn't like the rehab story, okay, and neither do I. So we're good there.
She doesn't like the fact that he can go to. She might believe in rehab. She doesn't like the fact that whenever he wants to go to rehab, he can make a phone call and somebody will write 100,000, whatever it's going to cost him to
right,
go.
But at the same time, and in the same breath, I think maybe in the same paragraph, she keys in on the real factors in his life,
right?
Make the life worth living. That are things that we all should kind of strive for. And it's like, must be nice. You have a family, you have a wife, you have those things. Well, what if you didn't have them? And so, like, I get the resentment for being, if somebody's privileged and then they don't even work to try to deserve the privilege they have. I understand the resentment there. Like, don't you see that not all of us have these things? But I don't understand the resentment for being, for channeling the kinds of things that make you, how would you say, a mensch, a better person, a person of family and society.
And another way I put what you're saying is they both maintain values that they knew that they were violating.
Right.
She cried because her job, she's in rehab, I assume maybe because of employee insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a job, and her job is to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner and write about it. They pay her a salary and give her insurance for that. And she feels guilty about that. And God bless her. It's good that she feels guilty about that. And she says, well, I should be going. So maybe I should really cut back on whatever it is that got me in rehab.
Right.
And so let's go back to what the introductory theme in this whole thing was. We have people that believe in magic rather than research.
Mm.
And the research, she's saying, oh, he didn't come to the existential crisis he needs to that makes people get better. No, it's not. That's not what makes people better. And I'm going to read just a little bit of research. There's a man named Gene Heyman who looks at 4 giant government surveys. I mean, giant. NESARC had 45,000 subjects. And they trace their lives and they see who gets better and why they get better from drugs and alcohol involvement. And sometimes that Gene Heyman gets positively lyrical, and he talks this is just from an abstract, he talks about an issue that we've been talking about, lesions on the brain, or, Richard Restak. It's the synapses and the neurons that are causing the disease. Addiction's biological basis has been the focus of much research. The findings have persuaded experts in the public that drug use in addicts is compulsive. But the word compulsive identifies patterns of behavior, and all behavior has a biological basis, including voluntary actions. In other words, something takes place in the brain when you decide to shoot up. Okay, what's that prove exactly? Thus, the question is not whether addiction has a biology, which it must, because everything has a biology, but whether it is sensible to say that addicts use drugs compulsively. And so that's what he's making, is the levels of analysis argument. You can't look at people's brains and decide whether they're addicted. If the brain lights up when they take cocaine, okay. And even if they like that experience, whether they go out and take cocaine a lot is a separate question. And what influences that separate question, he measures. The relevant research shows most of those who meet the American Psychiatric Association's criteria for addiction quit using illegal drugs by about age 30, that they usually quit without professional help, and that the correlates of quitting include legal concerns, economic pressures, and the desire for respect, particularly from family members. So that's why people cease being addicted or quit taking drugs, or however they go about it. One more paragraph. That's the science of it. That's the data analysis of it.
How many people read that and say, well, obviously, but what's really going on? You know what I mean?
So when a person, the story I always tell, I was called to consult. There was a time in my life when I consulted with cigarette companies. I would never testify for a cigarette company, but a man had been smoking 4 packs a day since he was 14, longer than Uncle Ozzie. In his 60s, he had open heart surgery. And when he awoke from his medical coma, he said to his daughter, "Oh, could you get me a cigarette?" And his daughter said, "Dad, I'll get you a cigarette, but I'll never talk to you again for however long you live." And he stopped smoking. So what possible biological hypothesis do you have for a man who smoked 50 years of his life deciding he wasn't going to smoke? You're looking for the love gene? That sounds like some bestseller, the love gene. Are you going to find in his brain, oh, the love gene was activated just when his daughter came in, or her speaking those words, "Dad, I'll get you a cigarette, but if you smoke it, I'll never speak to you again." The correlates, this is from a separate study, paper. The correlates of quitting include the absence of additional psychiatric and medical problems, marital status, singles stay addicted longer. So Anna Marie Cox, it was a good idea for her to have a partner. I mean, I'm sure that's not why. Well, I'm not sure of anything. She doesn't talk about that. Maybe she realized that she'd be better off with a partner. Economic pressures, she's right. Not everybody can just push a button and get the kind of money that Hunter can. She might be one of them who doesn't have that kind of spigot of money. And so some people say, this isn't going to work for me economically. I'm going to have to quit smoking, for example. Fear of judicial sanctions. Concern about respect from children and other family members. Hunter Biden's got to be in that slot, right? He's not happy that he's in some derelict motel in LA and he's got 2 daughters and a very concerned father and other people back in Delaware, in Washington, D.C. Worries about the many problems that attend regular involvement in illegal activities, more years spent in school and higher income. more years. I mean, Hunter Biden has a law degree from Yale, for God's sake. He's not a man without sellable talents and higher income. How can higher income make it more likely for you to be in recovery? This falls in the category of, whenever I talk in an addiction conference, people have no concept of what America's like. You know what I mean? When, you know, or when people, in my memoir, I review a bunch of books by people who recovered, and all of them, of course, are well-off college-educated people. They write books. That's how it works. People in inner city Baltimore and Appalachia who don't recover, they don't write books. They don't have an education. They don't have money. And Anna Marie Cox poo-poos that. Oh, that doesn't matter. Of course it matters. And the data, the actual science shows that it matters. But more than that, if you often say to me, well, Stanton, don't you say, if we knew nothing about the science of addiction, if we only knew about common sense and what our grandmothers told us, then we'd be more aware of what's really happening in the addiction field than if we get a PhD and study addiction. And this is a perfect example. I have some notes here. So Heyman says that the data show Hunter got better for the standard reasons. He's a high prognosis guy. The ones Anna rejects, although coming from a prestige writing background and attending a high-priced rehab, she fits Heyman's database model. She's another example. She's apparently in recovery, God bless her. She may not know how many people at the bottom of the social scale without Hunter's advantages. She may not know how they fare. She has no concept of what the lives are like of those people in inner city Baltimore or Allegheny County or rural New England or Appalachia or like. So there's a Q&A that we're going to do, and this previews it a little bit. But I have two nominees for Heroes of the Year. Lorraine Newman is one of the original people at Saturday Night Live. She has a daughter named Hannah Einbinder. Lorraine Newman met Hannah's father in AA. And in the article, it says, so I'm familiar with heavy topics from a very young age. By her sophomore year in high school, Einbinder was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and prescribed Adderall. By the way, I happen to know Sarah Silverman was defined with depression and given antidepressants. And somewhere along the line, somebody said, you know, I mean, she was in college. She was diagnosed with depression in high school or junior high school. Somebody said, you know, maybe she should stop taking antidepressants. By her sophomore year in high school, I'm talking about Hannah Einbinder now, was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and prescribed Adderall. You and I have already talked about the comedian. I'll think of his name in a second. Can you help me out?
Seth? No, you're not talking about Seth Rogen.
Seth Rogen. And she did the same thing as Seth Rogen. You were very good on that. I said to you, are you okay with Seth Rogen? Seth Rogen smokes marijuana around the clock. He's very productive. And he claims it deals with his ADHD. Mm-hmm. And you and I and you said, okay, it's a free country. He's productive. He's not addicted. And then I said to you, if that were a client or a friend of yours, would you be satisfied with that? You said you'd prefer that he learned that he could deal with that without the marijuana. Hannah Einbinder's this interview took place a week or two after the Seth Rogen one. Einbinder cites this as a key shift. I was existing in this altered state for years that wasn't creative. Taking Adderall, I was closed off. She took Adderall and smoked weed every day, she said. That's a good deal of time that is lost. So Hannah Einbinder is also a comedian. forgive me, I would guess she's also Jewish. She's come to a, well, I think in her own personal life, Sarah Silverman may have come to some similar conclusion. I don't know. Now, don't cry when I read the second part. So she's on ADHD. She's in her early 20s. She comes from a privileged background. After auditioning for an improv team at Chapman University, she kept second guessing her choices. So when she was called back, she tried to do it without taking Adderall. That's the bravest thing anybody's ever done. She's been taking it since junior high school. She wasn't content with her performance. I mean, she's been taking Adderall every day. As Carl Hart points out, that's like taking meth every day for 10 years, perhaps, or 8 years. She says, I'm just going to go back without taking Adderall. She got the part and never took it again. Isn't that, it's the most moving thing I ever read. Not long after the comic Nicole Byer played at her school and asked for someone in the improv group to open for her, after that stand-up spot, Einbinder's life came into focus. I mean, she's only got 22 at the time. She's 24 now, I think. I came out of this fog and latched onto comedy the way some people do with sobriety. In other words, her parents are AA sober, and she's saying, I did something different. I got into comedy. Einbinder said, her eyes welling up with tears, it gave me a purpose. I don't know what my life would have been like without it. So she's the heroine of the year. And now I'm going to go to a separate article. Both of these appeared in the New York Times this past week. As we've often noted, the New York Times has become the addiction and recovery newsletter of the journal. So a guy who wasn't privileged, except he had some gifts, applied to college. And the title of the article is, I Don't Want to Sell My Pain. The word trauma doesn't appear here, but in the link, it goes college admission essays trauma. I assume the original title of the article was changed, but originally when they got the link, it had trauma in it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a kid in a neighborhood like the one I referred to in Baltimore. In my life, I've had a lot of unfortunate experiences. So when it came time for me to write my personal statement for his college application, I knew that I could sell a story about all the struggles I had overcome. Each draft I wrote had a different topic. The first was about growing out without my dad being involved. The second was about the many times in my life when I was violently threatened. The third was about coping with anxiety and PTSD. And the rest followed the same theme. So, I mean, I can't help, of course, but think about Gabor Mate now. This was a guy you don't have to say, oh, you had trauma, but you didn't realize it.
Right.
This guy's life is about trauma. Every time I wrote, I discarded and then redrafted, but I didn't feel good. It felt as if I were trying to gain pity. I knew what I went through was tough, and to overcome those challenges was remarkable, but that's what I have to offer. So, I mean, I kind of do a mind fantasy experiment, imagining him at a Gabor Mate's seminar, workshop like the one you've seen, where some poor idiot raises his hand and says they felt they had a mental problem or addiction, but they never had trauma. And Gabor says, oh, were you bullied in high school? And they discover the trauma the person doesn't have. How would Gabor and that whole group deal with a guy who, and those groups tend to be privileged people groups. I mean, they're all generally therapists or in college. They're not, Gabor developed his theories back in the Portland Hotel Services, Vancouver, which I visited with Liz Smith, Liz Evans, the originator. Those are people who've experienced trauma.
Yeah.
And so here's a guy you don't have to tell him he's had trauma. He knows all about that. You don't have to say, oh, don't you realize what you have to tell him? What I would hope I would get the audience to do is to say, it's not about trauma. It's about what you do with your life. That's what we're here for. That's what we're helpers for. That's what we're therapists and counselors for. How do people overcome trauma? And focusing on your trauma, he's specifically doing the reverse. What he did is what we do in our life process program. We sort of say, well, write an overly optimistic review of your life. We know you've had problems, that you've come to a helping service. Write it as though you were trying to impress people with all the positives in your life and your gifts and your skills and your resources. And that's what this guy in a mini version on his own is doing. He's saying, I'm not going to write about my father and the violence and the PTSD. I'm going to write about, how I've dealt with that, how I fared in life, and how I feel I'll be a good student at whatever college I'm applying to.
This whole thing about, how would he respond to Gabor's interrogating him? He's already sort of said it. It's like, I grew up and I had a lot of things go wrong. Do I have to really enter into the trauma Olympics right now? Can I just, now that it's done, can I just however old he is, I'm college age, can I just call myself an adult and start moving on? I don't want to talk about it.
He's applying to college. Maybe colleges have also become trauma tanks, like the Gabor and other therapy workshops. But the concept in college is that we're going to allow and help you to become a fully functioning, maybe gifted and skilled professional. That's why you're coming to this college. We're not going to set aside. There are colleges that have recovery and trauma dorms.
I'll tell you something. As much as colleges might want to sell themselves as, I don't know, how would you say it? Equal opportunity, to the extent that people with the most traumatic or the least privilege should have a fairer shot or more open opportunity. I worked with high school seniors writing their college essays. And so in that, I work with some universities and colleges who were people who read essays. Some of them will say, a college essay is basically, can you write decently? It's just sort of another metric. Some people say they take it more seriously when they read it, and what they're looking for is humility from a person to say, now I've gone through this, or I've thought about this, and I've come to the other side thinking this, and I want to learn more about whatever the thing is. So that's sort of antithetical to, you want someone to come in traumatized. It's more like you want someone to come in having realized their position as an adult in the world and wanting to learn more about it.
And you want somebody to have a fluid mind,
right?
Where they can, that's called cognitive behavior therapy, where they can redefine their experience in a positive direction and learn new ways of coping. And that's the best therapy for trauma and everything else is a belief in yourself, which this guy demonstrated, and learning new coping skills. And college is meant to help you in both of those endeavors. So we began this whole essay by talking about how pessimistic I am when some of the most advanced thinkers can't seem to penetrate, be mindful of what that Hannah, is her name Einbinder? I've already forgotten. And this young unnamed man have come to achieve, that they're rethinking who they thought they were. And, he has PTSD, he's been diagnosed with. She's been taking Adderall for ADHD forever. And both of them said, there's nothing about me that makes that me. I can be somebody different. And, Hannah, the comedian, says, oh God, that saved my life. And this guy is younger than her. I think she's 24 right now. I guess he's 18 or something. And he's saying, well, I want to save my life. I'm applying to get out of this neighborhood.
So let me reiterate. Let me do a callback to a point that I was making at the beginning of the episode. It was you kind of threw me in the category of the people who say, well, they mostly agree with you. Don't you think? Can't you give them a pass? But that's not what I was doing. The question that puzzles me still is that if you're a researcher and have done the critical thought involved in solving one problem, but can't seem to solve the next problem, are you more capable of solving some other fundamental problem, or are you less capable because you've already made a lifestyle out of your beliefs? Like Robert Whitaker, I do believe, because I've talked to all the critical psychiatry people in him, and his idea is, well, people are just getting diagnosed left and right, but they're just people. They're just who they are. And then they get diagnosed. Then he switches to, and then these medicines make them crazy. And
you do something similar with Carl Hart.
But
you say Carl Hart doesn't talk about why people get addicted, but he gets it.
But wait, so my question is, or my thoughts around that are, I would love to believe that people with such insight in some areas, in some domains, could at some point be persuaded that there's something more to life and whatever. But I actually think, and I think you believe this, that people with no names who just have life experience and are none the wiser about what they're supposed to believe are more likely, insofar as they're not indoctrinated, to come out with the right conclusion about life.
Well, I don't want to go all the way anti-intellectual. I mean, Gene Heyman is a professor at Boston College. His training is as an experimental psychologist. He's a data person. There are cognitive behavior therapists all over the United States who know about social learning. There are people who presumably read Gene Heyman's journal articles, though I wouldn't think there are many. So the data and information are out there to understand, and I know therapists who think this way. So I don't want to say, oh, don't get an education. I mean, this guy's going to college, and that woman she became what she became at college. And maybe she took literature courses that helped her to shape her comedian status.
Yeah, I'm not going anti-intellectual. I'm saying people who have wrapped themselves in wrapped a story for themselves, and they need to preach it in order to make a living now. I would love to think, because those people are critical thinkers, that they could change their story. But I think that, as you say, and this is sort of it's called Sundays with Stories, and they started off by trying to retell in a different, in a parallel universe, what the non-addiction sort of way of thinking might be like if you told the exact same story with the exact same data. And so I'm the question I'm posing to, I guess, to the universe, anybody out there listening, which you tackle all the time and we try to discuss, is what is it about people who are supposed to be able to be the best at interpreting the data that's out there, the minds that are supposed to be convincing us or telling us to open our eyes, look, there's more to the story. Why is it that they seem so less capable of coming to rational conclusions about fundamental things than people who just kind of are out there living their lives? Not saying that there's no place for academics, no place for data, no place for, I'm not a postmodernist or something like that, but I anyway, it's something interesting that.
And I want to give a nod and let's end this by, I want to give a nod to you. You're in an educational setting.
Mm-hmm.
You're in a clinical setting, a coaching setting. You're a helping person. Part of what we say is not to give people an addicted identity.
Right.
And part of that is to accept that they can change who they are. And you're saying, well, Stanton, I like to feel that these people have some words of wisdom in them, some knowledge, and that there are ways perhaps I could interact with them to expand that part of their thinking. So you can't put that down. It's a good impulse, and it balances out my little pessimism here.
Happy Sunday to everybody, and we'll tune in for the Q&A.